I was born in the covenant. I got to be 27, which is Brigham Young's definition of a menace to society. Apparently, Brigham Young believed that if you had too many older men who weren't married, that was the problem to society.
Yeah, well, maybe don't practice polygamy.
The reality that I came to is that religion's wrong. I don't care if it was on Mars or in Joseph Smith's head. When I read it, I feel Jesus. He's there. The general authorities give general advice, and I'm a specific authority over my advice and over my family. My wife and I sit down and say, what are we going to do with this? And we both look at each other and say, we're not doing it. Let's pray about it. Yep, we're not doing it. That wasn't even difficult at all. You don't have a conspiracy if there's no reason to. There's no reason to change an old woman's memoir of her son.
Unless you're trying to hide something.
He says that he asked, should I do this? And God said, you should join none of them because the apostles died and all of the authority on earth was lost. No, that's not what he said. He said, their hearts are far from me. And that was the Lord's condemnation of the people in Joseph's day. This is also when I realized that I'm getting kicked out of the garden. The garden is a protected place of innocence where people get to just be safe. And I have partaken of knowledge. I no longer am in the garden. The more heretical I get, the more my patriarchal blessing applies.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest was Brent Larsen. Brent went into all of his awakening journey, and not only does he have an enjoyable way of telling his story and expressing what has gone down in his life to wake up to the falsehoods that are in the world and in the church, he also has great insight on some of these new records that are coming forth, and there's so much controversy going on about these new records. Are they true? Are they not true? Do they teach good things? Are they pro-polygamy? Are they against polygamy? Brent's coming on to answer some of these questions and to just express what he has learned through some of these records, and I thought it was very fascinating, and I would encourage everybody to go find out truth for yourself and go to God with it. Join us for all this and more on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. Everyone has a journey they're walking, and along that road, we are met with potholes, road bumps, rain, storms, and sometimes just fog. But through it all, we're really just looking for one thing: clarity. Clarity so we can walk with confidence in that next step. There's one source I run to for that clarity. In the darkest of nights, Jesus offers me light that shines through even the thickest storms. Welcome to the Clarity Podcast, where we find clarity through the one who saves us all. And welcome to this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast. I'm your host, Claire, and this week's guest is Brent Larsen. Welcome to the podcast, Brent.
Hi, Claire.
Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. We're so excited to hear your story. And guys, Brent has really good insights on some of these other records that are coming forth that I'm really excited to hear about today. So let's go ahead and get into your interview. So go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us how old you are and where you're from.
So I am currently living in St. Louis area, and I'm 48. Yeah, 48.
Okay. All right, Brent, let's go ahead and jump into your childhood. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what it was like for you growing up LDS.
Okay, so I was born in the covenant. Like, I was born with so much Mormonism love that kind of rolled into my childhood before I ever started, that I was born with like a little crown of love just like set on my head, like, good luck, right? I had 5 sets of active LDS grandparents.
Wow.
Because of great grandparents that were still around. So I was definitely in the Nephi category. If I was writing a journal of my life, I had goodly parents. I was taught in all the knowledge of my father. I was nurtured in all the wisdom of my mother, right? We went to church every week. We read as a family every day. I mean, I don't know that it was every day, but as a teenager, it was the eye roll type of every day, right? So it was every day. And my father was in the military, so we lived all over the United States, everywhere but Utah. Well, Utah when I was really small. And I was kind of shy and small and stubborn. I'm told I'm stubborn, but I don't believe it. But I got over that, luckily. But so then when I was old enough, I got baptized. I remember knowing that I knew what it meant that I was getting baptized. I knew that I was going to be a mighty disciple. I didn't know what a disciple was, but I knew that I had loved one to another, and so I was a mighty one, right? That was my worldview. But I was committed. Like, I knew I was choosing the right. I knew if I messed up and I needed like mercy, I could kneel down and pray, and Jesus was with me. Like, and I knew that at 8. And I remember that there were 2 more kids in my class that were baptized the same day, because it was, my memory of my baptism is pretty vivid. And so I can like remember names of kids that I haven't seen for 40 years, right? And so that's really my childhood. I mean, I guess I was sort of the insufferable know-it-all of the primary, when the primary teacher's trying to get other people to say something, and I'm like, right, that was me. I was the little kid that thought he knew everything.
Nice. Okay. All right. So, what about when you were a young man and growing up in the church as a youth? Were you still the one that tried to know everything in Sunday school?
Yeah, so my youth, my mother passed away when I was 13. And so even though that wasn't what my youth was about, it kind of is, right? So you get to be 13, now I need strength. I no longer have the net, I guess, but I did, because we were like totally active as a family, right? Which meant I went to scouts, which means they took me out in the wilderness, and I learned how to set up a little house out of wood and fill it full of stuff and then light it on fire. And I ended up working my way to Eagle Scout. Not because I like set a goal and decided to be an Eagle, and not because my parents earned it for me, but because I went to everything. I was active. Every month there was a camp out. Every year we went to scout camp. You have to sign up for merit badges when you're there. You do. Really, the only part that was hard was the project. Hard in that I had to do it and not just participate. And I wouldn't have done it, but I had a friend who did. And he was a close enough friend that I was there while he's filling out the paperwork. And I'm like, this is doable. I could just do that. And so I did. And like, so then that got me through there. As a teenager, I received my patriarchal blessing from one of my grandfathers. And it's funny because the more heretical I get, the more my patriarchal blessing applies. And the more I connect with it, it's interesting. But so that's my youth.
Okay. All right. So you're growing up mainstream Mormonism, all the way, super devoted to what you were doing. So did you serve a mission?
I did. So I was
Okay.
called to the Utah Salt Lake City mission, which at the time meant Salt Lake County and Park City, which is what, Camas County or whatever, and then Tooele County. And so it crossed the entire state, but it really was just the valley from the point of the mountain up to Bountiful, but not Bountiful. That's so them. And my mission was, so I had a stroke on my mission, but
You did?
it was, and that's not part of my story, but I figured I'd share. So it was absolute burnout for 2 years. It was the best 2 weeks of my life, but it was spread out over about 2 years. So the rest of it was really hard. Right. So, and I spent a couple of weeks in the hospital, and then they put me in an area with a car because I couldn't be trusted on a bicycle and all that stuff because I was having seizures and stuff. But so I taught a lot of people for an English speaking missionary. And this is kind of where I discovered the beauty of people who care about each other being in each other's life, right? The people that I taught, where what I was doing was really valuable for them and me and for their wards, they were the people who were kind of already connected in. They were the people who had a friend that was taking them to church, right? These were, I discovered that there's no other word for it than beauty. There's just this beauty that comes from people together who care. and who want to be there for each other. And so I want to share one mission story. Okay. So I was teaching a person, and I'm going to leave her name out. We invited her to be baptized, and she wasn't sure. And so we said, well, why don't you pray on it and we'll come back, right? That's how you do it. So when we came back, she said, I got to tell you about what happened when I prayed, right? And she says, I prayed and I felt good about it, but like, I always feel good about things, so I wasn't sure, right? And we're like, okay. It's just like, so I took my Book of Mormon and I just opened it up and I did this number and asked the Lord to like answer my prayer, should I get baptized? And it came to pass that he said unto them, behold, here are the waters of Mormon, for thus they were called. I'd sure like to read the whole passage. But anyway, it said all the things that were on her mind. So she clapped her hands and said, yes, this is the desire of my heart. And so then she got baptized. And she had a ward that cared about her. She had a person from another stake who was in our correlation meeting, because we covered 2 stakes, because that's what you do in Utah, was in a different correlation asking if the other stake had people that we were teaching, and we said, yeah, we talked about her story without really naming a name, and he's like, is it? And he knew her name, and I was like, yeah. He's like, oh, she works with me, I'll show up at the baptism. She had people all the way around her, and she just got, and that was one of a lot of different experiences I had as a missionary. And so, and I share that one because that was one way to get an answer to a prayer.
Can you describe kind of your relationship with God, your relationship with Jesus Christ, kind of as you were growing up and then on your mission? Was it increasing? What was that like for you?
I did not doubt my mother knew it. Right? That was... so when Nephi received a bow from his father that was really a good bow, one day it broke and he had to build his own. And I received a bow from my mother, and it broke while I was a missionary, but it was not a problem. I had all the tools. I knew how to make a new bow. And thinking back on it now, I prayed because I didn't want to go and tell people, you have to join my church because we're so right. And I prayed because I was like, Lord, I believe this is right. I don't believe it's so right that everybody else has to do this. And so that was my major prayer as a missionary at the beginning, starting in the MTC, but into my first area. I need to know that this is so right that I'm supposed to tell people that this is right. And I kept not really getting an answer. And I remember wondering why, because you can feel the Lord there, silent. And I've always felt the Lord there, silent. And sometimes I can hear him smile, and sometimes I can get an eyebrow raise out of him when he knows that I'm just, deceiving myself as I'm telling him my story. And he's just like, okay, but that's not real, right? And I'm like, okay, fine. But I've never not had that. But so I finally prayed to know that the Book of Mormon was true and that I should be sharing it. And I got my answer. And the answer was, yes, you need to share this, and it's true. And I was good with that and thought, oh, well, then, yeah, church is true. Because, the dominoes, that's my answer. You just have to ask the right question. So, yeah, I've always had that. It didn't really grow, but it did break. My bow broke, but I didn't starve.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So you get home off your mission, and
Yep.
What's next? College, job, meeting your wife. What's next for you?
Let's zoom forward almost a decade to the reason that I got married.
All right.
So we're skipping a whole bunch of stuff that is probably pertinent in terms of my progression, but not really my deconstruction. But we should at least meet my wife. So when I got to be 27, which is Brigham Young's definition of a menace to society,
Wait, really?
I got a call. Yeah. So there's so Steve Young once gave an interview where he said, I've officially reached the age where my great-great-grandfather says that I'm a menace to society. Apparently, Brigham Young believed that if you had too many older men who weren't married, that was the problem to society.
Yeah, well, maybe don't practice polygamy, and then that probably be fixed.
Yeah, change the dating pool numbers, and it's not a problem. No, so I got to be old enough that people were like, "Come on, you should do this." And so I got a calling I'm in Chicago at this point in my life, and I was called. Chicago has 8 stakes that are the greater Chicagoland stakes. And so from an institute perspective, those 8 stakes are a council. And so there's a monthly activity where all 8 stakes try to have an activity together. And so the council has one representative from each stake. And the council president is the calling that you get if they want you to get married that year. Because you can't miss an activity. Like, you're not in a position to skip. Right. And so that's the calling I got. Right. So,
Nice.
Which meant that I went to several different activities. And I point this out because it's going to make a difference down the road. I also taught's not the word for it because I'm not an institute teacher, but we had for summer that year, there was a class who didn't want to stop meeting, even though there was no teacher. And so I facilitated a Book of Revelation study group, which was my first deep dive into the Book of Revelation since seminary. Okay. So anyway, at the summer activity or the mid-spring activity, we were at the park and there were several pavilions that all had different activities going on. And then like every hour and a half, there was a crazy round robin and everybody jumped and went to a different pavilion and met new people. And since I don't meet new people, I was at the main pavilion where I was running things, because the best way to run things is to sit at, a quiet place and play Uno with your siblings. So we're playing Uno and we have very special rules for people in my family that are kind of dangerous. I mean, they're not physically dangerous usually, but it's not a spectator's version. If you have about 6 people and you don't actively play, you won't play. So that's how our rules work. But so my now wife, she came up and saw that people were playing cards, and she's like, "Well, that's cooler than all the other activities." And so she came over and she sat down. She knew half the people because she was in the stake that I was attending institute. So we knew some of the same people. She just kind of came over and was like, "Deal me in, what are the rules?" And she survived more than one hand. In fact, I think she did fairly well. And so that Christmas, we got married. Right? I mean,
because she was good at playing Uno, you got married.
Well, that was what kind of broke the ice, because you don't play Uno like a crazy person with somebody that you're not willing to be a little bit vulnerable with, right? And so that was when we started dating.
That's awesome.
That was the beginning of it. And so then fast forward to Christmas, and between Christmas and New Year's, and we went to the temple and we entered into an eternal covenant to walk together with Jesus.
Okay.
And that is how we met. And we've been teaching primary together ever since.
Okay. So now describe your role in the church as you're getting married, you're starting to have kids. What's going on in your church life and in your spiritual life?
So I've been involved in primary almost entirely since then. So my patriarchal blessing tells me that I will have the honor and privilege of teaching those who will still be here to welcome the Savior when he returns for the second coming. And the phrasing is such that I'm thinking that specifically sounds like I don't last that long, but I'm going to be teaching kids who do. And so I've been fairly happy to just hide in primary. And it turns out they'll let you hide in primary if you want to. And so I did. So I've been the Cub Master for several years, and just taught, and I've nothing but enjoyed it. Like, it's great. And I actually move a lot of times with the class because I'm fine with kids that you have to scrape off of the ceiling when it's time to send them out. Like, it's fine. Like, Jesus still loves them. So, I mean, I don't know that they heard what we were talking about, but we tried. And I don't think that their parents are thinking, why can't you just teach my son better? So I'm thinking it's fine. In fact, I had kids that I taught in nursery, and then I taught like 6 times because there's this trio of terror, and I liked all 3 of them. I thought they were great. And so 6 times might be an exaggeration, but when they made it to senior primary, the entire senior primary just moved with the class because why not? And Cub Master for the boys, because if you Cub Master them, then you can scare them and make them think that you know exciting, important things, and have cool drums that make noises that are just amazing. And so it doesn't take much to convince a 9-year-old that you've got cool things up your sleeve. And then you have their attention. So so I'm on coast mode in terms of testimony, but I'm actively involved, and I'm making a difference, and I'm being edified by the fact that I'm making a difference. And so I'm happy with that. Like, I'm ready to just coast. We did make, and I want to point this out because it's part of my story, we made a timeline in a basement. So it was an open plan basement with nothing but wall all the way around, except for like the laundry room in the back. But so there's literally 70 feet, if you go circumference, of timeline as you come down the stairs on one side. 7 days of creation, and Adam and Eve, and the flood, and pyramids, and Greece, and the Nephites over here, and then the Dark Ages, and then the Renaissance, and then if you keep going around the corner, then you have the Restoration and the movement to America. Like, I can sit in my basement folding laundry and have the visions of eternity. Like, right? I mean, it wasn't quite going to an exceedingly high mountain and being able to see the history of the world with an angelic host, but I could see the scope of all of God's glory. In my mind, this was, my glory is to bring to pass the immortality, eternal life of man. And this is that story, right? And so and it took us like maybe 4 years to put together this timeline. And I had to make several decisions about how to do it because you can't actually build a timeline. And I also had to look at it and think about the implications of some of the things that I saw. If you ask the Jews today, when was Adam, they're going to put him at like 3700 BC. And if you ask the Catholics when was Adam, they're going to put him at 4004 BC. And if you use the same math, but you use the Greek version of the Old Testament that the apostles had, then they're going to put him at like 5600 BC. All by doing math and assuming that the scriptures are so perfect that they're accurate. And then if you look at the history of the world and you say, even if the earliest Pharaoh was an exaggeration, he's not off by 1,000 years. And so as I'm looking at this whole thing, there were decisions that had to be made about what do you trust? And the reality that I came to is that religion's wrong. And I have so many evangelical friends that really shudder when I say, I'm sorry, but it's wrong. And it's wrong. And it's okay that it's wrong. Like, because as I was looking at it saying, I can see the fingerprints of God all over my wall. And it's wrong, right? I don't think I got it right. I just was able to lay it out in a way that I could see very interesting things. And there's truth in it, even though it's wrong. And so I kind of came to grips with that concept at this point in my life.
That sounds like that was maybe the beginning of kind of your wake-up journey.
I suppose. I say that because it sets up the rules for my wake-up journey a little bit, but it's certainly not. I wasn't sitting there thinking, I don't think I can believe that the church is true. Like that was not the problem,
Right. Usually the
right?
first point of everyone's wake up journey, none of us are thinking that the church isn't true. It's not until
Yeah,
you look back that you're
yeah,
like,
no.
oh.
I wasn't sitting there at the end of my timeline thinking it's not. In fact, I was looking at it thinking there's something here. Okay, fast forward to 2015-ish. The um, the gospel topics essays came out, and a guy that I work with who was in the other stake. So I knew he was Mormon because you always know that people are Mormon, but I didn't know him that well because he was in the other stake, right? But I worked with him, and so we would have, if we were eating lunch at the same time, we would all eat together. But like, yeah. But so he rage quit. He read the polygamy essay, and his whole foundation was just shattered. He was like, "I'm out," and I was like, "What?" And he told me all of his reasons, and I was like, "Okay, but like, you're looking at it through today's perspective, and you're taking your morality and you're pushing it onto history, and that's not fair." And I also had a father who was nice enough, especially since I was going to Salt Lake, where the Tanners have a setup and are looking for missionaries. He gave me kind of these are the things that anti-Mormon things like to push on, and there are explanations, and these are them. And if one of these bothers you, before you rage quit, go read one of these, and you'll be fine. So I wasn't worried so much when he lost his entire foundation and just was like, "Ugh." I remember thinking, "Oh wow, you just were not prepared by your parents. They didn't love you like mine did." Right? That wasn't how I felt about it, because I knew that he was in a rough spot, and I can have charity for that. But I wasn't in a rough spot just because I heard the things that bothered him. I mean, I didn't know that there were dozens of women that were supposed to have married Joseph. But I knew that it was more than one or two. I mean, I knew that there was polygamy. I'd seen the Beehive House. I knew that polygamy meant more than a couple of people.
Mhm.
But so I did take this moment in my journey, and I stopped and I defined truth, like what's important, what's not important, what's scripture. This is where you stop and ask questions like, Bruce R. McConkie says that the earth was baptized, and it had to be by immersion, because we all know if you don't go all the way under, then we're going to do it again, right? And so the earth had to be completely baptized. So help me, McConkie, right? I mean, this had to be. And this is where I stopped when I was thinking all this through and saying, what is the foundation? Right? Because I needed a foundation. Because any one of these things can be false. I'd already decided that I didn't care that the dates were false. And I had already decided with the flood and the timeline that maybe it's a timeline problem, and maybe it's just that the flood only was in an area. And I didn't really care which, and I decided I didn't care which then. But this is the point in my life where I looked at it and said, which things do matter? And I discovered that they don't. Like all the things that we think matter, we can, when we die, we can go to the Lord and say, what about this? This is, and the Lord's going to be like, oh, that is not what I said. Right? And we'll say, well, you explain it to me then. And then he will, and we'll be like, oh,
Oh,
wow, I never even thought of that.
right.
So we're so worried about so many things that
Yeah.
literally, like maybe it was the Yucatan Peninsula, and maybe it was the Philippines where the Book of Mormon was, and maybe it could have been anywhere, and literally no matter where it was, it doesn't change your life. What changes your life is the principles, right? So when Joseph said, I told the brethren this is the most correct of any book on earth, and that a man would get nearer to God by abiding by its precepts than any other book, he didn't just say it was true, he defined truth. And truth is, if you try it, it works. Like this brings you to Jesus. And I'm thinking, I don't care if it was on Mars or in Joseph Smith's head. When I read it, I feel Jesus. He's there. And so, like,
Mhm.
And this is when I discovered that as I started listing out things like, what if this is false? What if it really is a Trinity and not a Godhead? What if it and I'm just listing out all the things, and I realize there's literally nothing. The foundation is Jesus. Like everything else is debatable,
Mhm.
right?
Oh yeah.
And so that's about the point in my life where I discovered that that's it. That's the foundation. So in 2017, that's when I did another deep dive on the book of Revelation. Because, and like shout out to Ashton, the world was supposed to end in 2024. It totally was. I had it mapped out. I had it figured out. Two
Yep.
eclipses, a nice X
That's
right
what
over
Ashton thought.
Missouri. It was time. And it wasn't just the book of Revelation. It wasn't just the eclipses. I mean, there were reasons. In fact, reasons that other people haven't even brought up in places that I've seen. And I'm not going to go into them because they don't change anything. But
Mhm.
I had mapped it out and I was waiting. But then in 2022, even though that was a perfect time, according to the book of Revelation, for things to get worse, and they did, before things got worse, I was supposed to see a mountain fall into an ocean, and like there should have been a meteor hitting the oceans. Like there were things that didn't happen. And so by 2020, I was like, maybe it's not really over in 2024. So I had already decided that while I was watching, and I had thought through all of it because I had read through and like really tried to map out the book, it was obviously not a perfect match. And so I decided, it's also possible that my dates are off a little. So 2022, because you like to ask about 2020.
Yes, let's go back to 2020.
Yep,
What did
2020.
2020 do for your wake up journey?
So literally nothing happened in 2020 that was exciting for my wake up journey. However,
Okay.
I we had a 2-week slumber party to stop the spread because I had a freshman in high school who didn't want to be alone and didn't want to be surrounded by kids. And she had friends who didn't even have siblings. They were going to be alone with their parents. And so, and we had a basement. Like it was amazing. We were able to make mattresses appear. And we told all their parents, it's just for 2 weeks to stop the spread, And they agreed to not go out and be social because they would all hang out in our basement and do whatever they wanted. And so it was like, wow, that's my 2020 story. We had a blast. Nobody in my family got the jab because we looked at it and we were like, no, show me 10 years of back history and stuff, and then let's talk. Like, it's not that we never get any jabs, but like, no, I want to. You can't use science to prove things that don't have history that proves it. Like,
Right.
I am 100% sure there's no hidden documents that prove that this is safe.
Right. Mhm.
Right. So we just didn't. And since we don't live in the bubble, there was zero pressure. Like the closest thing I got to pressure was an email saying, click here and you can see President Nelson get his shot and in the harm, and I was like, okay, but I don't care. Not my problem. And so we just didn't. Yeah, that's my 2020 story. That's the whole thing.
Okay.
I almost got fired over not getting in
Mm.
just because they were going to blanket lay off everybody that didn't. But then when it came close to time, they said, oh, we're not laying off everybody. Right? We want to stay in business, and so we're not throwing everybody out. So yeah, that's my 2020 story. It's
Okay.
not really part of my deconstruction journey, really, because
Okay.
I was already comfortable with the idea that the general authorities give general advice, and I'm a specific authority over my advice and over my family. My wife and I sit down and say, what are we going to do with this? And we both look at each other and say, we're not doing it. Let's pray about it. Yep, we're not doing it. That wasn't even difficult at all. So yeah, well, yeah.
I wonder if that comes from too that you were never. It doesn't sound like you were ever like a true Utah Mormon, where like in Utah it was like follow the prophet and get your jab. At least that was kind of the social cultural thing going around, and maybe it was different in other states. What do you
I
think?
think there was less pressure.
Mm-hmm.
I do remember feeling like when we didn't wear masks, but they asked us to, but we were kind of allowed to go even if we didn't. There was that period of time. I do feel like there were people in the war that were like, really? And we were just like, really? In 2021, it was the last time we had Come Follow Me for Doctrine and Covenants. And it would have been just like last week in 2021 because we just covered Doctrine and Covenants 19. And I ran into a scripture there that really bothered me. And it's the one, I'm not going to read it because I don't want to take too long, but it's the one where God says to Joseph, eternal punishment is not forever in hell. That's punishment from me because I'm eternal. And I read it and I thought that's pretty slick because, I mean, that fixes the whole God hates people and sends them to hell problem. And at the same time, God's a liar. Because my mom told me, and I trust my mom, she told me that if you say something and you know that somebody's going to understand it wrong, and you don't fix that, you're lying. And that was my mom, and she's right. Right? And so I went to the Lord about that. I was like, I don't see how you can fix my problem here because it says you're not a liar. Like, you can't lie. And this is lying. You told millions of people forever in hell. And now you're saying, actually, it depends on your definition. And this is lawyer speak. And I was like, even if you've never lied in terms of like your wording is so perfect that you can weasel your way out of it, I can't trust it because I don't know that what I'm reading and understanding is the thing that's the truth. And so I just went to him. I said, I mean, I don't not believe. I don't like, I don't see how I can ever trust you. And what is that? I mean, what do you do with that? And I thought that he would not be able to answer me. Like, I thought he was going to be like, wow, because I was like, how can you possibly say something that's going to make me feel better when I don't believe you? Right? I was sure that I had cornered the Lord, and like, now what? And I didn't want to, but like, I didn't see a way out. There was no good way out. And he said, and not in words, like I didn't hear a voice, but I did understand not just warm feeling. This was complete concept. He said, if you don't feel like you can trust my words, can you trust my intentions? And he said, because I am going to do what's best for you because I care. Right? And so if I have to use more urgent language than reality because you're kind of stubborn sometimes, can you trust my intentions? I said, sure, why not? Right? Because I do. Like, that's when I discovered, yeah, I can trust your intentions. That whatever it is that you are inspiring me to do, once I know for sure that it's you, that even if you're going to adapt, in the moment that I'm acting in good faith on advice from good faith. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm fine. So I gave him the impossible puzzle, and like not even seconds later, he's like, but this broke something. This completely eliminates the concept of Bible bashing. The entire sport of disagreeing by pulling open scripture and being like, you're just misreading this obviously worded phrase. No, there is no correct interpretation that's so obvious based on the language that you can argue with people and tell them they're wrong. I don't see how that's possible, because the Lord, it looks to me, and I've actually seen this pattern more and more over time, that the scriptures are designed like a poem, that the more pieces you add, the more interesting the other things get in ways that you would have never thought. and it brings out things that are pre-planned and beautiful. Like, I don't have words, but so we'll get to that because that's my actual story. So that's that.
Okay. All right. So the next is 2022. What happened in
Yes.
2022?
So we hit 2022. This is the year of the podcast. And so I was introduced to at least a dozen wonderful people. Some of them are Mormon apologists. Some of them are not. This was a year where, since I work from home and as long as I'm productive, I can be listening to whatever I want. And I don't have to listen to the same music as the people like next to me. I can listen to podcasts. So I must have consumed hundreds of hours of podcasts. So like Rob Fotheringham, I Believe Joseph, Hemlock Knots, 132 Problems, Who Killed Joseph Smith, Denver Snuffers Speeches, Gospel Tangents, like Mormon book reviews. Like I listen to all the things, and and none of them really bothered me. Even the ones where I was like, wow, man, they got something there. That is interesting. It was never like rock the foundation because none of those things are about my foundation. And so I was just like, man, that's interesting. But so this gave me a pretty clear, after a year of listening to all this crazy, I got to the root problem for all of it. And the root problem is that there are multiple reasonable viewpoints. People who look at the history, who aren't just reading some blog, but are honestly looking, can come to very different conclusions about the history, and the other team can't disprove it. Like they can say they can, but there are literally multiple reasonable viewpoints. And since none of us are scholars, well, most of us aren't scholars. I'm not. There's no way that the masses can say, I know. Right? And that's the problem, is that there's multiple viewpoints and they're contradictory, and it matters. The things that they're saying make a huge difference. And so then I decided that the real question for me, it revolves, because all of the conspiracy theories, the conspiracy is that Brigham Young and a handful of leaders of the church completely whitewashed history and rewrote it to fit their narrative. If you get that, you can prove any of these things. And if that's not true, then all of the conspiracy theories are like, you can't stand on anything. But if you're willing to say, did Brigham Young completely rewrite history because leaving it the way that it would have been bothered him for whatever reason? Is it reasonable to say that that's true? So I went to the Lord and I was like, how am I going to find out whether or not that's a reasonable conspiracy, whether or not that theory has merit? Because Rob Fotheringham's work very clearly lays that out, but he has picked them and he's showing me what he found. I don't know that that's a full survey of the evidence, right? I can only say he picked those. And it's the same with the apologists too. Like they pick the ones they like, and then that's the one that you get, and whichever one you like because they're nice, right? They win. And so I went to the Lord and I was like, what I need is a document from the time that can be a witness to me saying this is the church before Brigham Young got behind the wheel, so that I can compare it with what I'm living, and I can ask the question, because they're going to be different. I can ask the question, is this a natural flow of time and things change, or is this the work of conspiring men? So I prayed about it. I said, Lord, what do I read? I really only need one thing that I found on my own that I can read and say, yep, there it is. And so I prayed about it. I was like, where can I find a thing that, because they've already dug out all of this stuff. Like, I'm not going to find anything new. And the answer came really fast. Really fast. And again, this is just idea. This was not words. The Lord said, why not read Lucy's book? And I thought, oh yeah, that's Joseph's mother, right? She's gonna tell things from a completely her bias is Joseph is a wonderful kid, and I'm on board with that bias. Like I can inherit the Joseph's a nice guy bias from his own mother, especially if I can read a document from that time period. I was like, this is perfect. I was like, oh, thank you, because I own that book, because I inherited all kinds of crazy. Like I have the Journal of Discourses, like I have everything. I have an entire shelf of Mormon heritage all over in my living room. And so I went in there and I'm like, where's Lucy's book? I know I have that. And there it is. Like, I have Lucy's book. So I opened it up and I'm like, man, there's 400 pages almost. And I'm going to have to read it. And I'm going to have to like recognize the thing that the Lord is telling me that I can find here. And I'm like, oh. So I pray before I start. I'm like, Lord, I'm not that bright. Right? So when we get to the page that has the things, at least make me look at the page, because I'm just going to be reading. And it's going to be enjoyable-ish. It's history, that's fun, but it's boring. And I'm like, you're going to have to help me find it. But let's start at the beginning. And I'm like, okay, the history of Joseph Smith by his mother. I only had to read one page. Okay? So I turned past the title page, and this is the introduction in the first Utah edition. And it tells the story at the beginning of the introduction. It talks about how Lucy dictates this to her scribe, who she paid, I guess, Mrs. Corey, who writes it all down and makes 2 copies of the manuscript. And then she moves to Utah and gives one her copy, because she gave Lucy one and then she filed one away. And then when she moved to Utah, she took it with her, gave it to Brigham, who said, oh, this is a very interesting book. Thank you. Poof. Nobody's ever heard of that copy again. And then the other copy was Lucy's copy, and she gave it to William. When she died, he inherited it. And William sold it to a guy in Massachusetts or whatever, probably when he was moving again. He moved a lot. Mr. Isaac Sheen. Now, in 1852, Orson Pratt got called on a mission to England. On his way, he stops at Mr. Sheen's house, who says, have I got a thing for you? And Orson Pratt's like, I'd love to publish that, because that's what he did, especially in England. So he bought it, this original, the copy that Lucy received, and went to Liverpool with it and did the first thing that he does with everything when he gets to England, and that is he published it. And then, and I'm going to read this because this matters, even though it's a paragraph and it's old book, so a paragraph is long. So he purchased it for a certain sum of money. He took it to Liverpool with him, where without revision. So this is being written by whoever is the editor in Salt Lake at the time. So he, without revision and without the consent or knowledge of President Young and any of the 12, except he was one of the 12, so obviously some of the 12. It was published under his direction in 1853, and afterwards discovered that the book contained errors occasioned by it not being carefully compared with historical data. And I'm like, oh, very interesting. Okay, some of the statements in the preface written by Elder Pratt were also in error. One, especially, that the book was mostly written in the lifetime of the prophet, and that he had read it with approval, was incorrect since it was written in 1845. So I can't substantiate or not substantiate that, but they were very not okay with the idea that Joseph was familiar with what might be in this book. The year following his martyrdom, so it wasn't written until then, but that might have been when she finished it. For these reasons and others, mostly of a financial character, it was disapproved by President Young in August 23rd, 1865. And this edition, that edition was suppressed or destroyed. Like they hunted these books down and burned them.
Oh my goodness.
Which, when you don't have the money to publish books, you hate that book. While other statements contained in the work were considered somewhat overdrawn, a circumstance easily accounted for when we remember the age of Mother Smith and losses she had sustained by the death of her husband and 4 sons and the consequent lapses in her memory. Right? So I can believe that her telling might have been a little fantastical, might have been inaccurate, might have been any number of things, but not go to Liverpool and burn those books. Right? That just didn't add up for me. But so anyway, and then it goes on and on. Subsequently, a committee of revision was appointed by President Young, consisting of President George Albert Smith, Judge Elias. Judge is his name, Smith, not his title. Cousins of the prophet, men personally familiar with the family and thoroughly conversant with church history. They were instructed carefully to revise and correct the original work throughout, which they did, reporting their labors to President Young to his entire satisfaction. The revised and only authentic copy thus prepared and reported upon was retained by President George Albert Smith, and shortly after his death, it was committed into my keeping. This is Joseph F. Smith who's writing this, where it has remained until now. And now here's this book that won't ruin the testimony of your children when they read it, because it agrees with our version of history. And I said, I don't even have to read this book. And I got my answer in more than just tea leaves. That was an admission. That was like, ha ha, I got to it first.
Oh my goodness. Ooh.
So I was like, well, anybody whose conspiracy theory requires a concerted effort to cover up history has ground to stand on.
Yeah.
And while I don't necessarily, I have my opinions on all of them, I don't necessarily feel like people need to pick a particular side of any of these issues. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have whichever opinion you have on any of these issues that are hinging on the conspiracy, but you don't have a conspiracy if there's no reason to. There's no reason to change an old woman's memoir of her son, even if it's a little bit off.
Yep, unless you're trying to hide something.
Unless you're worried.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that was my answer, and it was same day. I was expecting to have to invest time into that, and no, the Lord said, actually, I would be happy to point you to a place where you can be satisfied that you know the answer to this question. And so there I was. That was the end of 2022. I spent a whole year listening to podcasts with all these crazy ideas that I entertained in my mind. I allowed myself to have multiple views that I was comfortable with, because none of them are from my foundation. So tell me all about it. Let's build what does the puzzle look like if we build it with those pieces? And then it all ended with that. And I was like, oh, okay, well, So here's what this destroys. The prophet can lead you astray. Which was already, Rob Fotheringham has an excellent video on where that concept came from. And just go watch it and you'll be like, oh, you're right. That's not doctrine. Never was. That was an excuse to follow Brigham Young, even though you know that he's wrong. And it just was also convenient to use that excuse when you're correcting his mistakes. And so they did. And we still use it today. But so that's gone. The other thing that destroys is the entire Brigham was Joseph. We were at this fireside, or we were at the church conference, and Brigham looked like Joseph. And for that one, I had already discovered that was wrong, because I went looking for any sort of document that actually was a person testifying that they saw that, 40 years later in journals. And I'm thinking it's because there was a conference 40 years later where they said, make sure, and if you were there, go home and write in your journals for your descendants so that their testimonies won't be shattered. And so they did. And there's dozens of people who have journals that say, I was there and I saw, and what, but they had been hearing for 40 years what it is that they were supposed to have seen. And so even if they were genuine, they were not, I can't, yeah. So the whole Brigham was Joseph thing is, I can't go there. And then the other thing that it eliminates for me is the idea that there's a celestial football game going on, and that Joseph got taken out, and then Brigham Young's the new quarterback, right? And that God has a team, and there's the other team, and football's on our side, and this is Brigham, and and then after a couple of innings, now we're going to switch over, and here you go, John, you take you're the new quarterback. The entire celestial football game, no, that's totally out the door at this point. And then I reflect on the first vision, where Joseph says, which church should I join, right? And this is what we share as missionaries. We say, and God said that none of them are correct. And what you need is authority. Or at least that's the way the manual reads. or that's where they take it. But if you go to the words that are in the testimony, they aren't even written by Joseph. I think they're written by Orson, but they're summarized by Joseph or otherwise. He says that he asked, should I do this? And God said, you should join none of them, because the apostles died and all of the authority on earth was lost. No, that's not what he said. He said, their hearts are far from me. And so it wasn't that everybody who held the priesthood died and we've been waiting for angels for 1,000 years. No, it's that if you look around you, you're surrounded by people who are lying for the Lord. Like, I don't know, whose hearts are not in it. And that was the Lord's condemnation of the people in Joseph's day. Their hearts are not in it. Not, there's this thing called keys. So the keys concept fell apart big time for me at that moment. Because I was like, because I do believe in keys. I believe that when God came to Joseph and said, well, yeah, God did. I was going to say what an angel did, but no. And said, I have a work for you to do. That he gave him keys because he wanted him to open a door. And those keys included like permission. They included instruction. They included ideas, inspiration. Like, it wasn't just nothing. And it wasn't like Dumbo's feather where it's like, here, because you're holding this, you'll be able to fly because you believe in yourself. It wasn't that. It was a commission, but it wasn't an exclusive commission. Nobody else is allowed to act in my name. He just said, I want you to act in my name. Here's the keys. He did that for your podcast. He said, Claire, here's a door I want you to open, and here's some ideas. Go do that. Right? That's what keys are. So it's not that I don't believe that there are keys. It's that I don't believe that, like, if you don't have the stake president's permission, then you can't do these things. And if you don't have the bishop's permission, you can't do I don't believe in keys as such. I believe that keys open doors. This is when I realized that I can't have recommend, because I don't believe in keys. And like, the question is like, do you believe that the keys? And I'm like, no, I don't. I'm sorry, but I don't believe in the keys. This is also when I felt like I wasn't sure where I should send my tithing. And the Lord said, I'll tell you where to send your tithing. And I thought that meant, oh, I'll probably almost never pay it. And I'm pretty sure that I pay as much tithing as I used to in totally different ways. And it is so much more edifying than it used to be. I mean, it used to be fulfilling to know that I had done my thing, turned in my thing, checked off my box. And now it's edifying, and where it never was before. And now it is. This is also when I realized that I'm getting kicked out of the garden. Even if I'm not in the garden is a protected place of innocence where people get to just be safe. And I have partaken of knowledge that is, I no longer am in the garden. Even if I'm going to church with people in the garden, teaching kids in primary, I'm not in the garden. But it's a beautiful garden and they haven't thrown me out. And so I still go there. It's a beautiful garden, right? And there's people there actively trying to come closer to Christ. And wherever two or more are gathered in his name, that's where he is. And so I go every Sunday with my family, and I gather with people who want to gather. And I'm sure that I'm there gathering with people who aren't there for that reason. But there's enough people there who are that I'm like, these are my people. Like, I love these people. So, sure. But so that is when I decided that I was no longer in the garden. Even though I'm active, I'm not. Sure. This is also when I told my wife. And I said, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be an active member of the church. I said, I don't know if I'm going to leave, or if they're going to throw me out, or if they're going to invite me to leave, or how it's going to go down, or if it's going to be 2 years or 10 years or 30 years. But I don't think it's the rest of my life, or at least I don't expect it to be. But I don't think it's tomorrow. And she was like, all right. I was like, you don't. She's like, so I don't want to tell her story. But we're in this together. And she is way more interested in traveling the path together prayerfully than she is in what path we're on. She's like, don't drag me to lots of different churches to find one. Like, that was literally her only objection was, I don't want to go visit lots of churches and act like we're trying to find a new home. And I'm like, no problem, because neither do I. That's like talking to people and nah. Okay, so that gets me through that whole thing.
Yeah, so let's dive into the records a little bit. What part did all these new records that are coming forth, what part did that play in your journey? And then maybe let's get into some of these records.
Okay, so 2023 is the year of the records. I found most of these, I want to say, from probably listening to Gospel Tangents and hearing people talking about different things and stuff. And so all I had to do was go hunt down these records that he was talking about. So this is going to be a faithful telling, meaning I'm not going to try to tell you what I think about how good or bad any of these records are. My criteria for including a thing is the person seems to have come from the Restoration. And the record is at least worth knowing about. And because the first time I gave this presentation, it was about to compare them to Joseph, they needed to have enough similarity to be a discussion, because the discussion was more about, are their translation experiences, do they inform us about Joseph's? Because there's lots of questions about Joseph's translations. And it's like, well, we could compare and ask if we can learn. But so that's not what I'm going to focus on. I'm just going to run through them real quickly. But I have slides, so here they are. So firstly, there's the Book of Mormon. This came forth in 1830. It was from actual physical plates. 68 plates that were translated. That comes from another record. The fact that we know that. That's not gospel. That's not canon. They were bound by these rings, and it had this sealed portion that was like 2/3 of the book. So the first 116 pages of what they did was from the Urim and Thummim, is the way that he translated it. And the rest of the book, depending on who you ask, was from the Urim and Thummim or a stone in the hat or whatever. And I don't really care because it's true. So have a nice day. But so he did have scribes, and he would read and they would write. He did the whole thing in 3 months in 1829. And by my count, it has 633 pages. My count means if I copy the whole thing and paste it into Word and make the font the size I would prefer to read when I print it off, it comes to 633 pages. And the reason I use that page number is because I can do that for all of these, and you can get a feel for the size of the books. And it was published in 1830. Right? It is, briefly, a record of the Nephites. That's 1,000 years from 600 BC to 480. And then also the Jaredites, which goes from the Tower of Babel time frame, so like 3000 BC to 250 BC. And that 3000 is very liberal on the timeline, because my timeline stretched way back further than most people would want it to be. And for anybody that cares about that, too bad. You don't have to believe anything I say. So the next one is the Book of the Law of the Lord. This came from James Strang right after Joseph Smith died. And there's actually two things that he did. He had what's called the Voree plates, which are little like business card size plates that he unearthed. And then also the Book of the Law of the Lord, which he translated from 9 by 7 by 9, so a reasonable sized book, physical brass plates. And he says these are the plates of Laban, or from the plates of Laban. I do not know if there were scribes. He did it. The Voree plates were just 2 or 3 little business card size things. And 1 month, it says that he read them in this month, published them that same year. The whole thing fits on 1 page. It's an interesting little prophecy just saying, by the way, there's this prophet that's going to exist. It's a prophecy saying James Strang should be a prophet. Right? Okay. Then, so the Book of the Law of the Lord is published in 1851, and there's 42 pages. There's actually more than that because he has prophetic commentary in each chapter at the end. But I'm thinking the translation piece adds up to 42 pages. So the Voree plates is the final days of a civilization where this group gets wiped out, and so they put a quick thing down that says, here lies us. And he translates that and says, oh, this was these ancient people. Which to me is a lot like the Zelf story, where they're doing this thing and Joseph's like, there was this guy named Zelf. And suddenly there's this lore behind it. And like, what does that even mean? Except his had plates and he had witnesses. Like he carried them. He would hand them to people who would ask and be like, yeah, here's my plate. And they'd be like, man, those are amazing. And he's just like, I know, right? And like, that was it. Like, and so thousands of people followed him because he had plates. Like, this is Joseph Smith all over again. And then the Book of the Law of the Lord, this comes from the plates of brass. It contains the Decagogue, so the 10 Commandments. And it's a much longer telling than the one verse that we get out of Exodus. It's noticeably longer. And it has other passages that are similar to what you find in Deuteronomy and some other stuff. It's interesting. And I'm going to refrain from actual commentary on what it is. Okay. This one I'm going to skip for time, but this one's beautiful. You should go look it up. The Church of Jesus Christ, so the Bickertonite group, they have an inspired hymn book. Like, they're kind of a Pentecostal branch of Mormonism. And this woman, Arlene Buffington, she just like would get the mic, because that's what you do, and stood up and sang a song, and then had music scribes who would take it down. And their hymn book is an inspired gift of tongues style, stand up and sing it. It's cool. And you can listen to them online. There's a whole website for it. If you search Songs of Zion, you'll find it. It's neat. And the entire story that I would list here is from the website, and I'm going to skip it for time. The Writings of Moroni. This is by Hava Pratt. Hava is a woman that was originally LDS. She joined a breakoff group in Utah, and then she received in the roaring in her ears while she's out by the river doing laundry, a dictation by Moroni telling her, write this down. And so she does. And there's 38 pages of stuff that's never really been published. So the copies that we have come from people. She would do like people within her group. They would do Sunday school, and she would give them a hand printed off copy of her revelation, and they would study it, and it was neat and fun. And then they'd go home, and so people have it in their desk, and then it's a mess because then they pass it and somebody wants to type it in because they need a word processor version because the photocopies are different. So there's copies that are different and people are changing it. I'm finding that I wish it was preserved better than it is, because it's interesting. It's an interesting read. But it's events from Moroni's life after the Nephites fall.
Interesting.
All right. The Ayat Kuyat Nemenha. This began to come out in the 2000s. And it wasn't released that year, but that's when it started. And so it's in order at 2000, because I'm moving through time on these. So this came from many, many small stamp-sized plates. Philip, or Dr. Landis, he went to the place in Manti where these plates are stored up in the mountains. He saw and touched them, and he did some of the translating in the, I don't know what you want to call it, in the vault cave place there. But most of the book is not from that, because there were people who found it and were selling off artifacts. And so the Native Americans who knew about it, who were like, that's our records, because it's not just his family records that were in the vault. They picked it up and moved it to a different place. So most of the record that we got, he got by walking on the way. His translation method was he would meditate until he's walking on the way. So in vision, he would go into the cave and he would do what he was doing before in vision, and he would write it down. And oftentimes with the original author to talk to about it, to get the meaning. as he's trying to figure out how to word this in English, he would talk to the author. He didn't have any scribes. However, they did have a council. There were other people who were translating the same record as him. And so once they no longer could go to the place, and they met each other, so they knew there were 4 people on the council from all over the globe, they would meet on the way and argue about the best way to do the translation. And the woman who was translating, who was from somewhere in Asia, she was like, that is not a masculine pronoun, and you're mistranslating it, to the other 4 men who were just like, yeah, but scriptures are he, he, him, all the way for anything scripture. And she's just like, that's not what it says. And they back and forth on that for months. And then they got to a point where it was very obvious you're not supposed to translate it that way. And then he's like, I got to go back and repent for not listening to the other people who knew what they were doing. But so anyway, they had this council, and I don't understand how they interacted on the way, because the way he describes it, when you're on the way, you don't speak words, you speak ideas. And wow. So I don't know how they argued about their translations, but there you go. So it took 20 years to translate the whole thing. The first publications were in 2004, and the final one is in 2022. And on my printer, it's 1,200 pages. So it's at least twice as big as the Book of Mormon. So it starts right after Captain Moroni. Haggoth sails up into the land northward, and Haggoth is the great grandfather of Philip Landis. And it follows their ancestral line all over the continental United States, depending on the time period. They lived in lots of different places. It follows multiple lines, and so they're living in opposite ends of the continent at some points, until Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce. That's how far the record goes. And that's a generation or so before Joseph was the end of the record. And then Philip Landis comes through Chief Joseph. That's his Native American line. Which, if you ever meet him, he looks about as Native American as I do. And that's what happens when you're like a 4th or whatever. There comes a point where they're just like, yeah, maybe.
Okay, so actually, before we go ahead, can I just ask extra questions about the Nemenha record?
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is the record that is very controversial in the nuanced Mormon community. Some people believe it, some people don't. There's arguments. I've heard crazy things about it. I've actually read this one myself. So, what are your views on Cloudpiler? Because he's one of the key players that make people question this record. What are your views in relation to him?
My views are biased. He doesn't live that far from me. We don't hang out except during the winter or the fall celebration, because they have a get together. It is within driving distance, well, within a day. Like, I can get there and participate. So I have sat down with Cloudpiler and the other chiefs of the Nemenha, and my opinion is biased because I love these people. Like, I don't think my opinion can or should tell people whether or not they should trust the book. But this is a man who has literally no incentive to give you this book. Right? It certainly was not worth the cost of publishing from his standpoint. It was 20 years of his life. He got thrown out. He used to be a high priest group leader. Like, he got thrown out of literally everything. And yeah, I mean, it changed his life, and in ways that I'm sure he is glad. But at the same time, he didn't write this because I'll show them. I'll write a crazy Book of Mormon fanfic that's going to take me forever and not make me anything, and I'll just lose literally everything in order to do this. Like, that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And that's the best I can do for that. I also will say, at the last fall festival, we got together. It was large enough that not everybody could participate in the part of their ceremony that has limited space. And so a group went and had like let us tell you what the Nemenha are like. And I went with that group because I didn't RSVP and claim a spot in the other spot. And it was, we passed around like a prayer bowl. So the person holding the bowl, which is like you're receiving the blessing into the bowl. So it's kind of like I'm catching rain. But the person with the bowl, not that nobody else was allowed to talk, and it's not that you had the floor, although if you held the bowl, you could stand up and ask people to hear, or you could just pray silently. But it was kind of like moment of silence for the person holding the bowl. And it took like 45 minutes to pass the bowl all the way around. And some people prayed vocally, and some people prayed in their own nuanced Mormon way to all kinds of interesting stretches on prayer and on God and it was the most touching spiritual gathering I've ever been to. And that's all I got. That's my opinion on the Nemenha record. I believe you should read it. I believe you should pray about it. I don't believe you should simply believe it. And I also don't believe, even if it's true, that if the Lord doesn't testify to you that it is, you're welcome to not believe it. Trust me, there are so many records that the ones that you need to care about, the Lord will help you know that. And if this is that one for you, it's a beautiful book. Like, love it. And if you don't like it, fine.
Okay, so here's another question. Do you believe that the Nemenha record is a pro-polygamy record?
Very definitely no. There is a person towards the latter end who was a progenitor of Dr. Landis, like Chief Joseph's great-great-grandfather, who had 2 wives. Because by that point in the record, it was not quite as don't do it. But very definitely, it is not a pro-polygamy. In fact, right from the beginning, its description of all the things is like, you know how in the old Brighamite temple ceremony, the devil comes out and tries to preach up a storm and tell people well, in the Nemenha version of that, where they're telling the history of the world, the serpent spirit comes out, and one of his ideas is polygamy. And he's like, because the strong should win and the weak should fail. And, the strong means you get to collect all the women. And it's very definitely not pro-polygamy. Like, it's very definitely not. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and tell a story. Sorry.
No, go for it.
There is a moment in time where it makes sense to have polygamy in the record. And this is where there's an entire civilization where the men get wiped out by disease that doesn't affect the women as much. And so there's a much higher survival rate for the women. And so when they move out of the area that they're from, the traditions of that people were that people needed to be married. Like, this was important. This was an important part of life, is being married. And to be single is to be not complete. And so the men from this other, we are monogamous and we do not believe in polygamy tribe had to have a council where they got together and said, do we refuse to bring these people in? Like, we can bring them into our city, but we're not meeting their need if their need is that they're supposed to be married and there's not that many men. Do we become polygamists? And this was a major question in the book, because the book is not okay with polygamy. And if you want to know how that turns out, read the book. It's amazing. It's a beautiful book. Mm-hmm. And if you don't like where it goes, don't accept it. And if you do, do.
Yeah, there's so much to it, and there's so much beauty in it. Like I said, this is the one record I have read, and to even pinpoint those few verses towards the end and to say it's pro-polygamy, you're missing out on a whole lot of beauty that book is holding, and the fact that the entire rest of the record is completely anti-polygamy. But the Bible has incest in it. Does that mean it's a pro-incest book? No, it isn't. And so that's where I would just encourage everybody to read it from your heart and to go by the Holy Spirit.
These are children of Lehi. It'd be one thing if these were children of Abraham, where polygamy was kind of, this is a thing culturally, and like, so you see it in the Old Testament. No, these are children of Lehi, and like generation one, they were like, no, no, and like it carried long.
Sure.
Okay, should we keep rolling, or do you have other Nemenha
Let's
questions?
keep rolling. Yep.
Okay. All right. So the Eng Akaltan. This is translated by a person named Elijah Enoch, and I believe that's a pen name. It was published in 2007, although the story says that it was from before that. But so there were copper plates. The translator went to a cave and was told they're in there, even though the door is sealed to the cave. But he could see like a mound in front of it with like a little plate that was like a memorial type of thing that explained in some language that you can't read that this is where the plates are. But so he didn't have them when he was translating. So his translation method was that he would go to sleep, and in his dreams, he would sit down at a table and he would read these plates, and he would look at the characters and he would allow them to tell him their words. And then he would piece them together and say, what's the sentence here? And then he would put it into readable English. And he would write it down on paper in his dream at his desk. And then he would wake up and scribe it all out onto paper. And over the course of several months, he did the entire record. Right? So 8 months long, back in 1987, is when he says he did it. But then he published it in 2007 because he was told when he was done to publish it in 20 years. And it's 165 pages. And I think that 165 pages doesn't include the part that he cut from Ezekiel, that he says, this is from Ezekiel, you need it because it talks about the temple. And the document says you should build a temple, so here's Ezekiel that describes it. But so the 165 doesn't include that part. So it's longer than that if you're just trying to read it casually. So the story here is that there's a group of Levites who left and traveled over to the Philippines, or that area. And it spans from like the 2nd century BC until the 10th century AD. And that's that whole record. Okay, so the Chronicles of the Children of Aaronic. This was translated in 2 installments by Matthew Gill, one of them in 2007, one of them in 2015. So there's the book of Aaronic that came from 24 brass plates. The book of the religious practices of the children of the light, or something like that. And it's from 10 brass plates that he got at the same time in the same box as the Aaronic plates. He translated those together, published them in 2007. And then the book of Aaronic, which it was an actual book, but not paper pages, kind of like some sort of durable material thing that was paper-esque, not really papyrus, not really paper. From the description, to me, it sounds more like Tyvek. That stuff that they use on the outside of walls where it's like sort of weatherproof and kind of, that's the way that I envision it. But I have not, that's not gospel. That's not canon. But so his translation method, according to the book itself, says by way of the Urim and Thummim. But in interviews, when people ask him, was it the Urim and Thummim? He says, I want to call them interpreters or translators. He's not as comfortable with that. I think that after he published it, he's like, I think that the fact that it was the Urim and Thummim was an assumption, and maybe it is, but like God never told me that. And so he's kind of backed away on whether or not it is the Urim and Thummim, but he would prefer to call them translators at this point. But the book very definitely says at the beginning, translated by means of the Urim and Thummim. But so he describes them as a red lens stone thing and a blue lens stone thing, kind of like you're trying to watch a 3D movie or something. Large enough that they're very awkward monocles. And he would put them up, and he could look at the records and like make sense of them. And he could read them. He also described that the book of Aaronic was kind of harder to translate, which I don't understand how that works. If the words are like, I don't know. I don't understand how that works. But apparently neither did Oliver Cowdery. So he did have scribes. So he had 2 scribes. He sat at the dinner table, and one scribe sat on the one side and the other scribe sat on the other side, and he sat at the head of the table. And at one point, they actually taped him on his head because he needed his hands. And so he's kind of like reading, and they're both scribing at the same time. And then at the end, they did it every Sunday for a few months. And at the end, they would sit down and read and compare notes and make a master copy from the two original copies. And if there was a question, they would discuss it between the three of them and say, do we need to go consult the book to get it right? Or do we remember what it said? And so that's the way they got it down to one copy that they're sure is what was dictated, which is, to me, way more reliable than Joseph's method. Because if Oliver Cowdery swapped out the name of a person, there's no catching that. Like, and I'm okay with that because, you know, it's the principle that is true. So anyway, they combine those together. This is essentially the Book of Mormon for the UK. It's the religious record of the people who ended up being, well, started in Stonehenge. These people built Stonehenge. That's the record's claim. They travel from, at the same time the brother of Jared heads out, they also flee that area. And they go north and up to cross the English Channel and then settle around Stonehenge. Anyway, he translated in 3 months, 116 pages. He translated this one in less than a year, but I don't know the total number of months. But it was published that same year and added 68 more pages. The Testimony of John by Denver Snuffer. So the Lord asked Denver Snuffer to retranslate the book of John for the New Testament. And he said, okay. And so he got, I don't know where his manuscript came from, but he got something that he's translating from. I don't believe it was handed to him by an angel, but I don't know that. But I don't have any reason to believe that it was. So he at first tried to just translate, like, you can go find out what the Greek says. You can look it up. You can study it out in your mind and ask if it's true, right? And he's like a month into this and not getting anywhere. And he went back to the Lord and he was like, there's no way I'm going to finish this. And I would respectfully like to be released from this calling. Like, please let me not do this. And the Lord said, no, but why don't I give you the gift of translation? And then, like, in a month, he translated it. And it's quite a bit more wordy than John. But if you've read the Testimony of St. John, you know what's in this book. And it's worth a read. Like, if you're afraid to read this because it might ruin your testimony, then you need to read this. Because you need to find a foundation that's not fear. But it's interesting and it's pleasant. And you can get it. He publishes, you can get it online. This is free. He's got if you go search Denver Snuffer, Doctrine and Covenants, it's in his Doctrine and Covenants as one of the revelations, where the teachings and commandments is what they call their Doctrine and Covenants. And it's in there. It's like section 172 or something, and it's long and it's got all of the subchapters, but just go read it. It's easy enough. You can get it PDF. It's free. You can also buy it on Amazon if you want to go get it, but you don't have to spend money on it. You can read pretty much all of these for free. Okay, so the Sealed Book of Mormon. This was translated by Mauricio Berger out of Brazil in 2018. He, and I'm just telling it straight like they tell it, he was given the gold plates. And he looked at them. 68 of them were already unsealed. And those are translated by Joseph Smith. They brought down 8 witnesses from, well, the story is that they invited people from the LDS Church who said, no, thank you. And so they invited people from the Community of Christ. And 8 English speakers went down. So the 3 witnesses are Brazilian. And the 8 witnesses are Community of Christ. And they all went down. They flew down to Brazil. They unsealed together the sealed part, counted the 42 plates, and said, oh, there's another seal. So inside of the sealed portion, there's another sealed portion. And the sealed book says that is the book that Christ will open the 7 seals of when he comes back. And so these 42 plates are preparation. Yeah, so there's more. And he didn't even translate all 42 plates, or I don't know that he didn't translate them. Only the first half of those were published in what we have. And so there's more that hasn't been published. He is the Urim and Thummim. He said that they are the Urim and Thummim. And to him, they were kind of like a prism, and he could use it to look at it like, I guess, a glass that, depending on, if you look through a prism, you can see different things. And he could get English or Portuguese. And so he had 2 scribes, one that was English and one was Portuguese. And as he was translating, he would phrase in English, phrase in Portuguese, just kind of back and forth. They would both write it down. They're all in the same room, and they would just alternate, and that was the way they translated. It took several months, and they published it in 2018. They started in March of 2018, and there's 132 pages that they delivered. Now, I'm going to admit, because people will look it up and then be like, you didn't tell me that half of the 8 witnesses later said, now that we've read it, we're out. They were like, it was an amazing experience, because they all testified. We were there, like the 8 witness testimony is, we saw it, they were physical, we hefted the plates, they looked gold to us, right? This is the 8 witnesses testimony. They did that. And then he said, and here's a translation several months later, and they read through it and they were like, no, I ain't touching that. And so a fair number of his witnesses have completely walked away and said, no. But he does have 8 witnesses who have seen it since then, because as people were dropping, he's like, all right, I need another person who's willing to be a testimony of the physicalness of what we have. Anyway, these and I'm not really trying to explain that other than to make sure that you know the whole story. So it contains the writings of Moses abridged by Mormon. And I was watching your discussion that was released earlier, where they talked about the prophetess Huldah. Mm-hmm. She is in the discussion because that scroll is the one that he's abridging in the book. And so it retells that story. And it also includes a book written by Jonas, the son of Timothy, who's one of the Lord's disciples. And it has advice on building Zion. It does not include the writings of the brother of Jared yet, because there's more. And that's that book. Any questions on that one? I know that one's controversial, like in so many ways.
That's interesting. I've never heard of most of these, so it's interesting.
That one is hard to get because they tried to publish it on Amazon, and then there were disputes over whether or not the word Mormon was copyright, and then Amazon won't touch it, and then there's arguments between this because they originally published it with these members of the RLDS Church or the Community of Christ, I think. I don't know if it was RLDS instead. That's a detail. Don't rely on me for which one that was. But ultimately, the people who started the copyright process in English weren't interested anymore. So the publishing is a mess. So it's hard to get, but it's easy enough to get a PDF of it if you look for it. And shoot me a private message and I'll direct you in places where it can be found. It's not hard to find. Anyway, so then the plates of brass. I believe this is the last one. So in 2018, these came out or started to be released. So this is translated by David Fairman. He lives in Ohio. the way that he says these are the plates of Laban. He sees them in vision. He's at this desk in a firelit cave with the plates of brass on the desk. He has never physically touched these plates. So he does what he calls a Kabbalistic meditation, starting with a calming breathing, and then he enters vision, and he's in this cave, and he can interact with the plates, and he can also interact with his keyboard. So as he's translating, he'll take notes, and he translates them in, and as he gets enough chapters that he starts to have something, he just publishes them a few chapters at a time and just they're accumulating. He has no scribe, but he does occasionally go discuss the translation with people and get help. Like he's trying to wrestle with it, and the Lord's like, I'm not going to tell you what that means. I want you to figure it out. And he's like, well, can you help? And he's like, go ask your wife. She's smart. Right? And so he was like, okay. And so then he'll talk to her over dinner and be like, well, I'm dealing with this, and these are the words, and these are the things, and like I can't make anything. She's like, obviously that says this. And he's like, yeah, it totally does. Right? So it's not that the Lord says, these are the words. Right? It's he can see the Egyptian characters. He says it is not Reformed Egyptian, it's Egyptian. And he can see projected up above that Hebrew characters in modern Hebrew, not ancient Hebrew. And he can see above that English. And in some cases, he has to kind of really want the English he has to ask it to come out. And he can kind of negotiate with it and be like, yeah, but that's not a cool word. You need a word that isn't politically charged. Right? And so he's negotiates with it, but sometimes the negotiation with it is, no, that's the word that I want you to use. And he's just like, it's not my work, it's your work. So that's how that works. He has no scribe. He's been going for 7 years now. First things were published in 2018. Right now there's about 550 pages, but this is a year-old presentation, so it's longer than that. This description is from Nephi. It's got Moses, the record of the Jews, the prophecies of the holy prophets, and the genealogy of his fathers. And I don't just give Nephi's. If you ask David, he's like, that's exactly how they're broken down on the plates. Like that's what it contains. And so right now, currently available, there's a title page, which is interesting. There's the 5 books of Moses that are completely translated. There's a book called An Account of the Life of Adam and Eve, which was recorded by Joshua. And the first 4 chapters of that are available. The Book of the Wars of the Lord is fully translated. That's Joshua's story, really. That's the conquest. And then the Book of the Judgments of the Lord, which is kind of like now that we're in Israel, what's the rules? And so it's still Joshua, but it's no longer conquest. And then it's only got the first 6 chapters so far. The prophecy of Enoch, which has a lot of the stuff that is in the book of Enoch that's available from other sources, from like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it is not the same. Like it's not the book of Enoch, but it obviously these are, if you go back far enough, appear to be the same source stories. But there's only 4 chapters of that. The book of Melchizedek, which I guess is called the Scroll of Melchizedek for whatever reason. And it's the first 25 chapters of a 72 chapter book, but the rest of it won't be released or translated until there's a temple, because it's for being in the temple. There's a book called The Record of Enoch, which we have 16 chapters of so far. We have the Visions and Parables of Zenos. All 12 chapters of that book are available. And then the Declarations of Noom. And there's 22 declarations, which are basically chapters. And that is the plates of brass. And I keep trying to find out, is that half? Is that a third? Like, how much more is there? And he's like, I can't tell you, but there's easily twice as much as has been translated. Because if you look at the Bible, and like, that's not half of the Bible in terms of story. All right. And then the rest of the presentation, I think we can skip for time. But the idea is, do they agree, yes or no? Like, do they prove each other? Are they witnessing for each other? And the answer is pretty simple. And I can sum it up with just one of the slides. Let's jump to it. Okay. Does the Book of Mormon and the Bible, are they harmonious? And it depends on who you ask, right?
Mm-hmm.
Catholic priest, Mormon elder, Protestant pastor, Buddhist monk, like, you're going to get very, very different perspectives on this. And the Bible, if you wanted to, absolutely does not allow for the Book of Mormon. And if you wanted to, it absolutely allows for the Book of Mormon. Like, and that's the truth. For all of these books, and there are parts, I'll be totally open, even records that I think I should receive disagree with each other in ways that I can't reconcile. And when I go to the Lord and say, what do you want me to do with that? The answer is, look at you, you're fine. You're doing fine. And I'm just like, okay, but pick which of these should I trust? And he's like, I don't know. Do they both bring you closer to me? And the answer is, well, in their own way. And he's like, well, you're fine. You'll be fine. And so, yes, these books disagree. And yes, these books agree. And if you want them to, they do. And I honestly believe that our children, our grandchildren, will read them like we read the Book of Mormon and the Bible and say, why did anybody think that these didn't belong together? But that anybody who's approaching them from new is going to look at it and be like, and I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. That's really interesting. Okay. So what part did all these records play in your awakening journey? And then you kind of titled your next section, The Perfect Storm That Broke You Entirely. So lead into that. What broke you?
I'm going to try to tell this relatively fast. So I couldn't explain to myself 3 of these prophets in random interviews, like Gospel Tangents or whatever. They mentioned that they were ordained by an angel named Raphael. And I'm just like, that's a Ninja Turtle. That is not a Mormon angel, right? Of all of the angels that you're going to draw out of a hat, Mormons are not thinking, I'm going to translate a record and Raphael's going to ask me to do it. Like, that's not a thing. I can believe that any one of these 3 people was just fascinated with like angel books from some Catholic bookstore or something and knew that Raphael was an angel. But there's just no way that these 3 people on different continents within a span of like 10 years without talking to each other are all ordained to do a work by an angel named Raphael. And that just bothered me. And I'm just like, the only explanation for that is that an angel named Raphael did that. And anybody who doesn't believe that that's the most reasonable explanation as to why that happened doesn't believe that a man can be visited by an angel and told that he has a work for him to do, and here's some ancient records that I want you to translate, and I'm going to help you do it. If you don't believe that that's possible, then you're right. The idea that these 3 guys all came with it, there's a simpler explanation. But if you do believe that that's a reasonable proposition, the simplest explanation for this thing is that Raphael is asking people to translate records. And so I'm like, I gotta at least read these and ask, because that doesn't mean, the simplest explanation doesn't mean that Raphael is a servant of God. Right. The simplest explanation is that it's from the other side of the veil and someone named Raphael wants you to read this. Right. That can be a wonderful thing, and that can be a not wonderful thing. Okay. So the first one that I read is the sealed book. And the very last chapter, that I'm just going to not mention any of everything else, even though it's an interesting book, go read it. Have fun. The last chapter is a commentary on the Jacob 5 allegory. And it's spoken from the perspective of Jesus. So you know how in 3rd Nephi, Jesus explains Isaiah, and they record it, and we have it. This is that, except at the same time, he also described this, and Jonas, the disciple, wrote down what he said, and they didn't put it in the Book of Mormon, they put it in the sealed part. And that's this. And it follows the olive tree allegory, and it's interesting. And I was underwhelmed and kind of disappointed, because it gets to the end, and there's this twist where it says, when I send out my people the second time, when I send out my workers the second time. And it's kind of like that second time word there, that phrase was like a key part of the motivating factor that it's time to accept it and like join my group, right? That's the call. And I'm just like, okay, but I'm comparing side by side with Jacob, and I'm like, there's no second time. Like, if you read Jacob 5, and I know that it's not in there because if I have word processors, and you can just say, search for these words. No second time in Jacob 5. And I'm just like, not there. Like, you're asking me to springboard off of a thing that's not there. And you're saying it's important. And it even has a footnote right there. And he's like, in Nephi, it talks about in the Isaiah chapters, Isaiah mentions a second time, right? So whoever put together the sealed book is adding footnotes. And I don't know if those were a scribe or inspired, or like, I don't know where they came from, but whoever was putting the footnotes in there, that was the best they could do with the idea that, no, this is a thing, right? It was not there. And I got to the end, and I was just like, I don't have any reason to say, no, this can't be of God, but like, And it was so underwhelming that it bothered me, right? But so I move on, right? That's not my book, or that's where I was at. So the next book that I read was the Book of Melchizedek from the Plates of Brass. So both of these are Raphael. The third one is Matthew Gilt, the UK. But his book doesn't break me like the other two did. They got together and they broke me. So even though I like Matthew's book and I enjoy reading it, it's not part of my break. So I'll leave it out. The Book of Melchizedek was full of what I'm going to call the mysteries. Okay. Everything about it is just like allegorically bizarre and very interesting. As you're reading it, you're like, there is depth here that if I spent some time on, I could understand. And my mind kept going back to this idea from seminary where I was taught in like Jacob, the first few chapters of Jacob, it talks about the mysteries of God and the Jewish people missing the mark because they were too focused on the other things. And the mysteries, according to my seminary teacher, the mysteries of God are the things that were distracting everybody. And so I was like, I don't know if this is true or not, but this is the mysteries, and I've been warned not to do this. Don't get distracted by the mysteries. Focus on the gospel. So at the end of reading the book, I went to the Lord. I was like, this is interesting and all, but I'm still going to pass. So then the next book that I read was the Book of Zenos from the Plates of Brass. And I'm reading it, and I'm like, this is the mysteries again. Here I am. And I'm also like, this is the Book of Revelation again. And I'm like, except it's not exactly the same, but there are verses that are, and so I'm cross-mapping them as I run into them, because I'm very familiar with the Book of Revelation. And I'm cross-mapping them, and I'm putting them over here, and I'm writing in both margins places where they match. And I'm putting together this match between the two books. And since I'm trying to blitz through it and decide whether or not I think it's worth reading, I'm not taking the time to really find all the matches, because there's several of them that I'm like, make a mental note. At some point, I want to go back and find all of the matching verses, because there's a lot. And so I'm like, but for now, I'm just going to keep reading. And so I get to the allegory. And I'm like, didn't I just read this? But I can't not read it. And so I'm like, same. I just read this a month ago. Same. And at the very end, it said, second time. And I said, that's not in Jacob. And now these two records have both said second time, like it mattered and like it was in the allegory. And in Zenos, it's in the allegory. And I'm like, that's not okay. That is not okay. Because that means that it's reasonable for a commentary by the Savior to the Nephites to include the concept of the second time, because it's in the Zenos record. And I'm like, well, where is this verse? Because it's verse for verse the same in the Book of Mormon. I'm like, where? And you get to the verse before that, and that's the end of Jacob 5. And you go to the next chapter in Jacob, and it says, and all of a sudden it's Jacob's voice. He's like, and now my brethren, and whatever else, and it's Jacob. And I'm like, why did they leave out these two verses that are at the end of the book of Zenos? And then in chapter 6 of Jacob, those two verses are what Jacob kind of uses. He, right after he gives his thoughts, he like says, and when they do this, kind of like a testimony of the, after the sacrament talk, the kind of wrap up thing. The wrap up thing is a quote of the two last verses that weren't in Jacob 5. And it includes that second time thing. And it was in Jacob. And the guy that did the footnotes in the sealed book didn't know it was in Jacob. Like, they didn't put that together when they wrote it. So whoever wrote that didn't. So now I have this other book kind of jiving in ways that bother me about another book. These guys don't like each other, much less agree. Well, they might like each other. Well, I don't know. Like, they don't know each other. And they certainly haven't like joined forces just because they seem to have these overlaps. They both came up with this thing, and then it turns out Jacob agrees. Like, now I've got the Book of Mormon telling me that these other records agree. And I'm like, I'm broke. I'm completely broke at that point. Because that was when I realized I don't have, like, if I was walking out on the plank of a pirate ship just to see, the view, somebody pulled the plank. And I'm like, wait, I'm still out here. Because at this point, I can't dismiss either of the books, even though they don't really agree with each other. They just agreed in a way that I can't explain. And I'm like, I'm broke because, and the Book of Mormon now agrees, even though it didn't before. And suddenly I went from underwhelmed to can't explain it in so fast. And I just went to the Lord. I was like, what do I do with this? Like, I'm broke. Like, I'm really broke. And he's like, well, you're not getting any broker. So calm down. He's like, you're not any broker in 3 minutes. So let's talk about this. And he said, remember how you were thinking maybe I should go through and find all the rest of those references and map them up and look at it? He's like, you could still do that and you won't be any less, like, that's not going to hurt you. And I'm like, oh, I wasn't going to do that. Yeah, that's going to be boring. So I went back and I side by side Revelation and I started to map them up. This maps to this maps to that, this maps to this. Because it's not just a straight quote. It's 2 verses here, 2 verses there. And the further along I get, the more I notice that, like, it's all the verses. And so, and there's a pattern to it. And it's almost easy once you start to recognize the pattern to see how you dice this book up to build this book and vice versa. And so I found all these connections, and the places that don't connect do connect in Nephi's vision, and his is a dice up of Zenos. And so, you know how Nephi's vision says, John had the same vision at the end. And you read it and you're like, these two visions these are not the same visions. Right? That's the take home from Nephi's vision and John's vision. And you're just like, not the same. But Nephi says they are. Well, now reading Zenos and comparing them all and seeing how Nephi is drawing from one of the chapters of Zenos, and it leads, and I'm looking at the whole thing and I'm like, this is the same vision. And Zenos had it, and here it is. And Like, I've been studying Revelation my whole life, and it's the most cryptically weird book on the face of the planet, right? No, not right now. It's the most difficult book to read on the planet. Everybody's got what it means, and everybody's wrong. And without any commentary at all, the Book of Zenith laid it out, and it's a simple book, and it's beautiful. And I'm like, wow. Because now I'm broke. And I hope I have enough time, because this is the part where it's my testimony. So sorry.
You're good.
So I went to the Lord. I was like, I'm broke. And so I went and I said, help me put this book down and never pick it up. Because I like it. It's neat. I'm broke. I am like Lehi had a dream. People who had the tree, who were enjoying the gospel and wandered off on forbidden paths. And I'm lost. So I was like, I need you to guide me back. It's my own fault. Like, I was curious. I was interested. I wandered off the path. Help me put this book away and never touch it again. And like, I can feel the Lord there in silence. And so then I ask, okay, how do I like, if I'm supposed to be the one that lets it go, if you're not going to help me set it down, how do I do that? Like, at least talk me through this. In silence. And then I'm like, well, should I let it go? In silence. And I'm just like, help. Right? And so then I asked, should I embrace this book that's full of the mysteries? Like, these are not okay things. And the answer was, with no words, just a smile, the answer was, yeah, that's one of my books. I'm glad you like it. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but I don't trust my own feelings right now. And so I'm glad that you're talking to me again and not just silent, but like, I'm going to need this in English if you want me to embrace this book. Like, because I'm broke, and it's a danger broke. And so I did what I watched done on my mission. I said, what do I do with this book that's full of the mysteries, and how do I let it go? Or if you want me to embrace it, help me decide that this is your book. And I went to Messiah 1. It said, verse 3. And he also taught them concerning the records which were engraven upon the plates of brass, saying, my sons, I would that you should remember that were it not for these plates which contain the records and these commandments, we would have suffered in ignorance, even at the present time, not knowing the mysteries of God. And I'm reading on. I'm going to skip a couple verses for time. I say unto you, my sons, were it not for these things which have been kept and preserved by the hand of the Lord, that we might read them and understand of his mysteries and his commandments. I'm just like, oh, the plates of brass have the mysteries. And then it said, we would, or even do not believe them when they are taught them, because of the traditions of their fathers, which are not correct. O my sons, I would that you should remember that these sayings are true, and also that these records are true. And now I have my favorite Book of Mormon prophet, the one I trust, saying, in very plain English, this book is true. And he says, we can know of their surety because we have them before our eyes. And I'm like, oh, so do I. Right? And then it says, remember to search them diligently that you may profit thereby, and I would that you should keep the commandments, and on. And so I'm like, okay, that was pretty clear. But I'm stubborn. And I said, okay, I'm glad that this is a beautiful book, and I'm glad that you like it, and I'm willing to like it. However, I would like permission to not openly like it. Right. In fact, I'm still willing to walk away from it if that's okay with you. So I decided to do it again. I said, dear Lord, just say that you love me because I want to follow Jesus, right? And that it's good enough to just believe Jesus and not worry about which records are true, right? And so I'm like, please tell me that I can be let off the hook for this. And so I open it up, and I'm trying to stay as far away from Mosiah as possible. So I open up into Ether. And it says, this is Ether chapter 4, verse 8. And he that will contend against the word of the Lord, let him be accursed, and he that shall deny these things, let him be accursed. For unto them will I show no greater things, saith Jesus Christ, for I am he who speaketh. And I was just like, okay, you win. Right? Okay. You win. I'm broke, and I'm not broke, because I know that I'm on the foundation. But what does that mean? And I'm like, well, so does that mean that this is the book that I should be interested in? And he's like, there's others. Like, read Nephi. It says that there's going to be records, and they're going to blend together, and it's going to be fine. And I'm just like, records? This one is bad enough that I'm broke. And he's like, I'm glad you liked it, right? I'm glad you like it. And so I say all of that, not because I want everybody to be like, the plates of brass are the one. If you feel that way, it's because the Mormon church has told you that a book means a particular church is the only true church. And that's not what that means. And I think you should let go of that. And I think you should read all of these books. And if the Lord invites you to cherish one, I invite you to do that.
Love that. Brent, thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on all of these records and your wake-up journey of how God brought you to this. I think it's beautiful, not only how much you've awakened to things that are going on in the church and in our world, but how much God has been a part of it in your life. I think that's the most beautiful part of your story. So thank you so much for sharing your story. And how do you find clarity in your life now?
Oh, I find clarity through a prayer journal. So if you write down the things that you're praying about, and then you read it like a week later, you will see all of the places where you forgot to be thankful. Because the Lord doesn't answer your prayer in ways that you see while you're still struggling with it. But he does. He answers all of them. And sometimes right after we stop caring enough to be thankful when it happens. And so as you're looking back on things that you struggled with before, that you didn't have clarity, you will find that you received clarity and you just didn't see it. And that's the way I find it, is through reflecting backwards and seeing what clarity I have discovered.
I love that so much. Reflecting backwards and seeing what clarity you have discovered as you walk this journey with God. Thank you so much, Brent, for coming on the podcast.
Yep, happy to do it. Thanks, Claire.
If you guys are interested in joining us for an episode of the Clarity Podcast where you share your story of how you have left mainstream religion to follow Jesus Christ, please feel free to reach out to me at clarity.podcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at the Clarity Podcast. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us on this week's episode of the Clarity Podcast.